All right, hello. This is Mr. Betz of St. Ignatius High School in Cleveland, Ohio, and today making a short video for a former student, Tyler, who asked me some questions about holiness for a project, and I thought I would record my response here for Tyler. And so here goes. The first question that was asked was essentially a story about when I noticed someone was holy. But I want to start with the second question, which is defining holiness. And then finally, I'll get to my favorite saint and how they've helped me become more holy. So what is holiness? You ask a theologian this question, so I'm going to start with the Bible and do a little bit of theology with you. We get a really robust discussion of holiness actually in the book of Leviticus, which is in the Old Testament. And in Leviticus chapter 19, verse 2, it says, "You shall be holy, for I, Yahweh, your God, am holy." So there's something about holiness modeling after our God who is holy that was clear even to the ancient Israelites. Be holy, it says. Etymologically, the key to understanding the word holiness is the root, I think it's zedekah, which means separation, or being intentionally apart from the profane and impure. So that's what holiness is. It's separation intentionally from the profane and impure. It's an intentional move of the ordinary folks like you and me, toward the divine. That's what it is to be holy. It's a pivot towards the divine in our everyday, to get away from the profane, or at least to rise above it. In the Old Testament, the focus was on holiness as sacrifice, as priestly consecration, as codes and vows. But there are some other things that are in the book of Leviticus even that I think are worth mentioning. It says, when you are a holy person, you don't defraud your neighbor, you don't steal, and you don't keep for yourself the wages of a laborer. That's Leviticus 19, verse 13. Furthermore, it says, you won't oppress the aliens or outsiders, people that are foreigners. The alien who resides with you shall be to you as the citizen among you. Leviticus 19, verse 33. Furthermore, people who are holy don't take vengeance or bear grudges against any of their people, but love their neighbor as themselves. That's Leviticus 19, verse 18. So that's the Old Testament on holiness. In the New Testament, we get it a number of places. I chose just a few here. St. Paul in 1 Thessalonians, which, side note, interesting fact, 1 Thessalonians is the oldest New Testament book letter that we have. We think it was composed maybe around 50 AD, which of course is 15 years before Mark. Anyway, St. Paul in 1 Thessalonians 4, verses 1 to 12 says that God calls all of us to a life of holiness. He says that. And there's a big emphasis on charity. And there's a way for St. Paul in which God calls us to act with our bodies that will make us holy. Again, think about that separation for God. Then in the Gospels, Matthew chapter 5, verse 48 is an often cited one on this topic. It says, be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect. Sometimes that word is translated as holy. Be holy as your heavenly Father is holy. So you see the theme here of trying to model after God in our own lives and choosing to do that, sometimes separating ourselves from the day-to-day or what everyone else is doing that makes us holy. Now, specifically in the Catholic Church, the Second Vatican Council, in a document called Lumen Gentium, in chapter 5, worth noting here, said that all who believe in Jesus Christ, regardless of their vocation, if you're a priest, you're a deacon, you're a layman, you're a laywoman, you're a son, you're a daughter, that we are all called to be holy. That's Lumen Gentium, chapter 5. And so the theory here goes that the church is holy, and anyone who is part of the church is called to be holy. And since we, the people of God, are the church, we're called to be holy. We're called to perfection in charity. And that's not as a result of anything but our baptism. Once we are baptized, we are called to be charitable and to try and perfect that charity throughout our lives. It certainly never quite gets there, but that's the goal. What does it mean for all of us? Listen, I think it means we're called to follow the way of Jesus. The earliest Christians were called the way for a reason, even before they were called Christians, because they followed the way of holiness, the way of separation for the good. And that doesn't mean leaving struggling folks or sinners behind. Obviously, Jesus didn't do that. But to say there's a different way and to try and live that way, that's holiness. Seeking God's will, devoting our lives to love, to service of God, self, and others. Essentially our lives are for God. And to be fully human means to accept that call and to become people that God created us to be, right? That we all have special gifts. And so holiness can even mean embracing the call that God has given us. And that's straight from the Catechism, paragraphs 356 to 358. So belief in all of this, what I just talked about for this first answer, is a gift. And we call that gift faith. Like believing that there's a God, believing that God calls us, and believing that God calls us to something specific that might mean sacrificing or changing the course of our life to serve the greater good. So to be holy, just like love, they're choices and gifts, if that makes sense. So, and now we can come back to the way I started the answer to number one, which is to the etymology or the root meaning of the word, right? Holiness means to be set apart for God. Thus, holiness is a yes to God with the understanding that we may need to make sacrifices or change course in order to follow God's providence, God's guiding us. And that's why Mary is holy in our eyes, because she says yes to God. She changes the course of her life to separate herself for the God that won't let go. Sometimes it's in big, grandiose ways, such as Mary, or giving up your life for a friend, saints like Saint Stephen, or even more recently, Saint Oscar Romero of El Salvador come to mind. That's a big change to follow God's providence, literally life-altering. But sometimes holiness is in small, seemingly insignificant ways. Saints like Saint Joseph or Saint Teresa of Lisieux come to mind. So that's what I think holiness is. The next question I want to answer was, when have I noticed someone who is holy? Great question. We need to look for it in big ways and in small ways. And I suppose I chose a smaller way in the midst of something big. So I want to tell you a brief story about a friend of mine, a friend of our family's. His name is Bill Richard, and he's Bill Richard of the Richard family. And the powerful witness he and his wife gave in a courtroom to their Catholic faith and to really ordinary, everyday holiness. So as you may or may not know, there was an attack at the 2013 running of the Boston Marathon on Patriots Day, which was April 15, 2013. Essentially, multiple pressure cooker bombs were set and went off at and near the finish line. And one of the explosions killed an 8-year-old former student of my wife's, Martin Richard. My wife taught him when he was in first grade. And he was 8 at the time. I think he was in second grade when he was killed. It also took off the leg of one of my wife's current students at the time, Jane Richard, who is Martin's sister. So Martin lost his life. His sister lost her leg. Bill, the father, lost hearing, most hearing in one ear. And his wife, Denise, lost sight in one eye. It's funny, I didn't know the family that well before the tragic event, except for stories my wife would tell me about how great this family was, the Richard family, and that they lived where we lived in Dorchester and Boston. Prior to the bombing, we actually had run into the family at a local park, and I was introduced to everyone. I think they were playing baseball that day, and really Kristen was the connection, my wife, but I remember them being a joyful, happy family. And of course, everything changed for them after that tragic day in April of 2013. And the way the community rallied around the families for support, displayed holiness, constant prayers was holiness. The way they turned to their Catholic faith, for Mass and all of that was holiness. However, my connection to the earlier definition comes at a defining moment on the witness stand months later. So the police killed one of the men and caught the other man. They were actually brothers who had planted the bombs. And the one man, Tsarnaev, was put on trial and convicted of all charges. It was pretty clear. And Bill Richard, the father of Martin and Jane, took the witness stand and asked the Justice Department literally to not give the killer of his son the death penalty. And he wrote, about his faith, and he cited the Catholic faith, and certainly our teaching today is that we don't accept the death penalty as moral. And he also said that the constant years of appeals and courtroom hearings, when you give someone the death penalty because they can appeal constantly, it would simply continue the anguish of their loss. So the family took a bold move to separate themselves from even the norm of what a lot of, I think, Americans were feeling, which was revenge, rage for this heinous act. And yet Bill and Denise said, no, we're going to go a different way. We're going to choose holiness. We're going to choose faith. We're going to choose action through love to follow the way of Christ. I've become more and more friends with the Richard family over the years. I ran a couple marathons to raise money for their charitable organization, which was named in Martin's name, MR8. And we remain in touch today. Certainly, I think they're very holy people. And so that's an example. Bill, Richard especially, but Denise too, they'll both be heroes in my book for the rest of my life. So my favorite saint, talking about holiness and everyday people and how they've helped me become more holy. I struggled with this question because I love so many saints, being a theology teacher, holy men and women who take this ordinary life and make it extraordinary. There's a lot of them. People like St. Augustine, St. Thomas Aquinas, St. Teresa of Calcutta, St. Joseph, and so many more came to mind. But at the end of the day, for this assignment for me, you told me to pick one, Tyler, and so I had to go with St. Joseph, my namesake, husband of the Blessed Virgin Mary and legal father of Jesus. We just celebrated the feast of St. Joseph the Worker on May 1st, and he has an additional feast day on March 19th. So the reason I chose him is because, I mean, how many saints have 2 feast days? That's pretty legit in 1 year. In all honesty, what I like about St. Joseph is that not how much he has about him, but ironically, how hidden his service was and how mysterious even today he is. We don't know much about him. And I kind of like that the mystery of faith attracts me. We know in Matthew's gospel that Joseph was a righteous man. He was tender, he was compassionate. I think it's important for men to be righteous, tender, and compassionate. I think it's hard for guys to do all 3 of those, and perhaps women too, but I'm speaking as a man, and I think Joseph gives us a good model of that tender righteousness. Joseph is told in a dream not to be afraid, so he's not afraid. He listens. I like people who listen. I think that's important. He takes his family to flee a murderous Herod, so he's brave, he's courageous. Without having much time, he makes a big decision to change his life. And certainly as a parent, I've done that. I mean, moving from Boston to Cleveland was a big decision that we made. And sometimes you just got to do that. And Joseph really models that for me. We know Joseph was a good dad to Jesus. In the Gospel of Luke, we know he was his dad for at least 18 years, we think. And he would have been the guy who introduced Jesus to wisdom and helped him grow up. We don't have stories about that, but we're pretty sure that he would have been around for those times. All those 18 years that we just have no real data on because it's not kept in the Bible. But if you use your imagination, which is an Ignatian thing to do, Joseph cared for his son. He taught him skills. He gave him the faith. Joseph quietly and without notice helped form Jesus and modeled for him the way to work as a tecton or carpenter probably, and live as a Jewish man. However, as soon as Jesus begins his public ministry, Joseph is no longer mentioned. Like, he's out of the picture. Our tradition holds that by this time, Joseph probably had died. So, it's a whole nother level for me and Joseph. This would mean that Jesus might have lost his dad before adulthood, that he might have grown up without, a father figure a little bit later in life, as he was a teenager. Joseph just disappears. And it's that hiddenness that is so intriguing to me. He appears, he leads a quiet service to God. He separates himself to do this thing that he hadn't planned on doing, and then he leaves. Subtle, quiet, humble. Joseph is a really good witness to being a family man. And since so many of you will someday become husbands, I think he's a good model for us to hold on to. There are many of us Christians who live quiet, humble lives of service in so many different ways, caring for your aged parents or for children, or, carrying whatever burden you might have been given in this life. I love that idea of humble, simple, but courageous servant leadership, and I think St. Joseph is a marvelous example of it. So anyway, those are my answers to the 3 questions. what does it mean to be holy? What's an example of someone who's been a model of holiness for me, and a favorite saint. So hope this helps you out. Make it a great day. This is Mr. Betz, Theology Department, Cleveland St. Ignatius, signing out for now. Be well.